נפתחה פה תיבת פנדורה באשר ליחס של קנדה כלפי נאצים ויהודים.
שלום שי.
שלום לימור. בשבועיים האחרונים נפתחה פה תיבת פנדורה באשר ליחס של קנדה כלפי נאצים ויהודים. קנדה היא מדינת מהגרים, מניפה את דגל זכויות האדם, גם במחיר דיפלומטי, ולא תמיד הייתה כזאת. היו ימים שהיה קל להיכנס לקנדה כנאצי ולא כיהודי.
נכון, והסיפור הזה מתחיל מיד אחרי עצרת האו"ם בניו יורק. נשיא אוקראינה ולודימיר זולנסקי בא לבקר בקנדה. קנדה מדינה שמחבקת את אוקראינה מהרגע הראשון שרוסיה תקפה. קנדה הטילה עיצומים על רוסיה, סגרה חשבונות בנק של אוליגרכים, הורידה את הוודקה מהמדפים, הוודקה הרוסית, וברור שזולנסקי בא לכאן לקבל חיבוק גדול. הוא גם יצא אגב עם $650 מיליון בסוף הביקור הזה, וזה בנוסף לכמעט $2 מיליארד שקנדה השקיעה עד עכשיו באוקראינה בכל הנושא של אמצעי לחימה, וכמובן שהוא זמן לנאום בפני הפרלמנט, וזה היה ממש ביום שישי לפני יום כיפור. כל חברי הפרלמנט השתתפו מכל המפלגות. זה היה אירוע שכאילו כולם עמדו שם ומחאו כפיים ביחד. לא הייתה אף מחלוקת באשר סיוע של קנדה לאוקראינה. אני מספרת את כל סיפור כאילו האווירה החגיגית הזאת כי משהו אחד העיב שם על כל הסיפור הזה ופתח שם, כמו שאתה אומר, תיבת פנדורה. יושב ראש הפרלמנט של קנדה אנטוני רוטה מחליט לעשות כבוד לאלמוני בסך הכל בן 97 שהוא הזמין בעצמו, והבן אדם יושב בקהל, קוראים לו יורוסלב הנקה, והוא מציג אותו, יושב ראש הפרלמנט מציג אותו כלוחם במלחמת העולם השניה, גיבור אוקראיני שלחם נגד הרוסים אז וממשיך לתמוך בצבא אוקראינה גם היום, והוא מוצג כגיבור אוקראיני וגיבור קנדי, וכולם כולל זלנסקי, כולל ראש ממשלת קנדה ג'סטין טרודו מוחאים כפיים.
מלחמת העולם השנייה ולוחם אוקראיני, מיד זה מפעיל את כל האזעקות.
בדיוק, ואז מתברר שהאיש היה לוחם בדיוויזיית הוואפן אס ה-14, זאת יחידת המתנדבים האוקראינים שלחמה תחת הצבא הנאצי. הוא נשבע אמונים להיטלר, ויושב ראש הפרלמנט לוקח אחריות, הוא אומר אני הזמנתי אותו, הוא מאזור הבחירה שלי, רק אני אחראי, רק אני אשם. ואם עכשיו תקרא קצת את החפירות שככה על הסיפור הזה, אז אתה תגלה שמשפחת הנקה תורמת למפלגות ולמוסדות שונים, למשל בית חולים באלברטה שבינתיים כבר הוריד את השם וגם החזיר את הכסף שתרמו. ובפרלמנט אמרו אוקיי בסדר, יושב ראש הפרלמנט התנצל, אבל סליחה, מה עם ראש הממשלה? יש פה לא רק תקרית דיפלומטית, גם בושה גדולה. איפה ראש הממשלה? וישב
ראש הממשלה, אבל ראש הממשלה לא אמור לדעת את כל הדברים האלה. מצד שני, יש לו עוזרים וכל מיני ערימות של אנשים שהיו אחראים על זה מסביב.
בדיוק, אז האופוזיציה שרכבה על הסיפור גם ככה, זה התאים להם. אז הם אמרו, רגע, מה זאת אומרת, ראש הממשלה לא, האנשים שלו לא יושבים שם ואומרים, תן לי את הרשימה בבקשה של המוזמנים, אני רוצה לראות, סך הכל, יש לי פה ראש ממשלת קנדה ונשיא אוקראינה, שהוא בערך יושב עם מטרה על הגב, אני רוצה לדעת שהכל פה בטוח, איפה ה-RCMP, איפה כל העוזרים של ראש הממשלה, אף אחד לא צלצלו לו הפעמונים, שיש רשימה של מוזמנים מכובדים ואחד מהם אולי נאצי. כן.
בעקבות הסיפור המביך הזה, הקהילה היהודית קוראת לפתוח את התיקים הסודיים שיש, ואנחנו החלטנו לרדת לשורש העניין.
אז בדיוק אתה נוגע בנקודה חשובה, כי אחרי שכל הסיפור הזה התפוצץ, גם ג'סטין טרודו התנצל, אבל הארגונים היהודים לא מוכנים לוותר. בני ברית אומרים רגע סליחה, אוקיי, הופיע בפרלמנט, יש לי שאלה, איך נאצי נכנס לקנדה? הזמנו את עורך דין מרק ויינטראב, הוא היה יושב ראש הקונגרס היהודי בקנדה, הוא ייצג את הקהילה היהודית באירועים שונים שנוגעים לפשעי מלחמה, וגם לאחרונה הוא הנהיג את הסיוע היהודי במטרה לעצור את, אם אתה זוכר, רצח העם בדארפור, סודאן, ואת הסיוע בתמיכה לפליטים מאוקראינה. הוא מאוד מעורב בכל מה שקורה לפשעי מלחמה ובעיקר נגד יהודים, ושאלנו אותו מה מצפה קהילה יהודית למצוא בחלקים הסמויים של דוח דושן.
Hello, Mark.
Hello, glad to be here.
Thank you very much, Mark. We appreciate your time. And I would like to ask you regarding the latest news coming from the parliament. Now, B'nai Brit recalling to open the secret files from the Duchenne Commission. And I want to ask you, what do you think, what do we expect to find there?
Well, we know that from the Duchenne Commission, which was the commission set up by Prime Minister Mulroney in February of 1992. And the commission was set up because there was a report that possibly the evil Joseph Mengele had possibly made his way through Canada to get to Paraguay or some other story. This was raised by a member of parliament, Mr. Kaplan, I think in the early 90s, and it caused great alarm within the Canadian government. And a commission was set up, headed by a very respected Court of Appeal, Quebec Court of Appeal judge, Justice Duchesne. And the mandate of the commission was to determine whether Nazi war criminals from the Second World War had arrived in Canada and lived in Canada and had been granted citizenship. And if so, and we knew that that was the case, how many had come to Canada and what steps could be taken to deal with war criminals who had committed war crimes outside of Canada years before. So the Duchesne Commission started its investigations. And to answer your question, at the end of its mandate, it took almost 2 years, I believe, but it released a report to the public. And that report identified the results of its investigations, and we can talk about what those results were. But there was a second part of the report. And the second part of the report contained names of suspected war criminals. That report was kept, as you said, secret. I don't know whether it's secret is the right word, but certainly it has not been released to the public. And we know that in that report will be the names of suspected war criminals. How much other material is in that second unreleased report? We don't know, but we suspect there's a lot of information on individuals who were suspected of being war criminals. The names of those individuals who the Duchesne Commission felt completely comfortable in disclosing as there being sufficient evidence to pursue them, those names were released. There was approximately, I think, 850 or 860 names that the Duchesne Commission ultimately came to the conclusion were either war criminals, they had been convicted in absentia, or there was enough evidence to convict them of war crimes.
How easy it is really to expel somebody for a war crime?
In Canada, it's been very, very difficult. You're 100% right. Of those 850 that I mentioned, 20 individuals were identified for possible pursuit, both for war crimes as well as lying on their immigration admission when they came to Canada. And of those 20, only several ever saw prosecution. And of those several, those prosecutions were not successful because of lack of evidence. There has been one successful case, Mr. Lushan, who was a botany professor or instructor in Vancouver. He had been convicted for terrible crimes in absentia. He made his way to Canada, but through the efforts of these efforts, but also various Jewish organizations, Canadian Jewish Congress, Simon Wiesenthal Center, B'nai Brit, really put pressure, and some individual investigators. There were successful efforts in getting him removed from Canada. He spent some time in prison in Holland, some time in Germany, but he lived to a long age, I think over 100, and he was released from prison, not serving his full sentence. To answer your question, it has been very difficult, and there's various reasons for that. Some of the reasons are that to convict someone in a Canadian court requires the highest standard of evidence. And while you're correct that there was new legislation enacted as a result of the Duchesne Commission, legislation which permitted the prosecution of war criminals committing war crimes outside of Canada. So that was new legislation. It was an excellent tool, you would think. But the laws of evidence still needed to be applied to Canadian courts. And as you can well appreciate, going back to the Second World War with witnesses aging and dying and having to get evidence, particularly in Soviet-controlled countries, was exceedingly difficult. At the end of the day, I think we have to say that the prosecution attempts with these 20 individuals was not a complete failure, but was not successful. Now, the Canadian government made a decision, rightly or wrongly. Many of us think that it was not correct. They made a decision that it would be much easier to prosecute war criminals who currently committed war crimes. And so once it was recognized that this effort to charge and prosecute Nazi-era war criminals would be less than successful, and remember, most of these now individuals were in their 80s, 90s, and were dying. Some of them left voluntarily. There was a few successes, but there were 3 prosecutions of more recently of war crimes committed in other parts of the world. I believe there was a police officer from Peru who was investigated in Canada. He had made his home in Canada, and ultimately he was forced to leave. There was one successful conviction of a war criminal involved in the genocide in Rwanda, and he was tried in Toronto. That was easier, and some of the observers say the reason it was easier to convict him was he did not have a community of support in Toronto. Some of the other alleged war criminals, those who were prosecuted from Nazi era, they did have more of a web of support of lawyers and advocates who tried to suggest that these individuals should not be convicted of war crimes. And the third was Sri Lanka. So to answer your question, has this legislation, which was enacted, has it been successful? There's been a modicum amount of success more recently because the Canadian government has decided to focus on more contemporary war crimes. But still, it's a very difficult type of case to prove. We've had one major success in Canada that I'm aware of. There might be several others.
Let's go back. What can you tell us about Canada's dark past?
Well, you know, Canada is an extraordinary country, and it has it's a beacon in many areas, but it has dark pasts, as every country has. Its dark past includes the treatment of Aboriginal people, which Canada is just coming to grips with now in terms of reconciliation. But with respect to the Jewish community, there is a very dark past. As I'm sure many of your listeners know, the Canadian Jewish community was really was a thriving, vibrant, powerful. By way I say powerful, I mean involved in every aspect of Canadian society, medicine and law and academia and music. And yet, in the 1930s, notwithstanding the contributions of the Canadian Jewish community to the Canadian mosaic before the Second World War, even though Canadian Jews never looked back to Europe, they never saw Poland or Russia or Lithuania as a country to go back to. They threw themselves into Canadian citizenship. Huge percentage of Canadian Jews fought in the Second World War, proud Canadians. Notwithstanding that, there was an anti-Semitism that existed in the Canadian government, and as a result, too many Jews from Germany and Eastern Europe were turned away before the Holocaust. The dark secret, dark past, which I think you're also referring to, is what happened after the war. So we have two huge stains, tragically, with the Canadian Jewish community. One is we did not let our Jewish brothers and sisters into Canada because of anti-Semitism. Once the war ended, the survivors, some of them had a difficult time coming into Canada. The only way some of them were able to come to Canada was organizations like Canadian Jewish Congress and other organizations vouching for the refugees and guaranteeing their livelihood. Specifically, what you're also referring to is, as difficult as it was for some Jewish refugees to come to Canada after the war, the doors seem to be open much wider for former Nazis, former collaborators. And that really leads us to, the present day crisis and the Duchesne Commission. I need to say this. There are some estimates that upwards of 3,000 Nazi members or collaborators made their home in Canada. The Simon Wiesenthal Institute, I believe, or Center, estimated 2,000. Remember how we started off by saying the Duchesne Commission identified approximately 800 or 900, and of those 800 or 900, they decided only 20 were worthy of an investigation. So you can draw your conclusions from these statistics. There are many informed advocates and academics who think the number of Nazi war criminals and collaborators was very high, and they were given far too easy access to Canadian citizenship. That was the reason for the Duchesne Commission, and that's why you're hearing now something good might come out of this, tragic mistake of honoring Jaroslav Hunka, and that is a call for opening up these files of the Duchesne Commission to find out how much should we have known as Canadian citizens. Now, you don't want to have the reputations of individuals who are innocent to be besmirched, because how could anything be worse than being named as a Nazi? It doesn't get any worse in our society. So that's the reason why some of these files in the second report were kept secret. But now there are calls, and I think proper calls, for opening up these files. I think there can be due process and proper protection for the rights of individuals. We need to see what's in those files. The Speaker of the House resigned. But how did the Speaker of the House get into that situation? And will we find out who is the individual who set the Speaker of the House up for this terrible honoring? I mean, you can well appreciate, you had everyone clapping for this man who was a member of the Waffen-SS 14th Galicia Division. You should also know, however, that the Duchesne Commission looked at this particular division. This is the division of the SS that was militarized. The Duchesne Commission came to the conclusion that just because you were a member of this division didn't necessarily mean you were a war criminal. Now, many people disagreed with that, but the Duchesne Commission said, just because you were a member of it, we are not going to de facto classify you as a war criminal. So, in some of the public discussion, we're going to hear, well, this man who was honored, yes, he was part of the Waffen-SS 14th Galicia Division. That doesn't necessarily mean that he himself committed war crimes. Many people will disagree with that.
Thank you very much, Mark Weintraub.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing this and for what you do.
הסיפור הזה על העברה האפל של קנדה עוד לא הסתיים. החודש באוטווה יערך כנס גדול בנושא אנטישמיות, וגם אנחנו נהיה שם.
נכון, שי, ונראה באמת אם יש איזה שהן מסקנות, לאן אנחנו לוקחים את זה מכאן בעצם, האם זה יותר עניין של חינוך, האם צריך להוסיף, כמו שחלק טענו, תוכנית שלמה על אנטישמיות ומלחמת העולם השנייה לתוכנית הלימודים בבתי הספר. נראה באמת לאן זה ייקח אותנו מכאן. תודה רבה.
ביי לימור.
ביי.